Welcome to the Ask a Catholic Lawyer podcast. I'm your host, Bill Baaki, and we have a great show for you today. The purpose of the Ask a Catholic Lawyer podcast is to be an educational resource to the Catholic faithful who oftentimes feel troubled and abandoned like sheep without a shepherd in this world today, as our Lord said in Matthew 9:36. The Ask a Catholic Lawyer podcast is for educational purposes only and may not be construed as legal advice, and it's no substitute for retaining a lawyer for any particular legal question or need that you may have. Now let's meet our guest today, John Bursch. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. Delighted to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you, John. John, what a resume that you have. It's incredible. You're the Vice President of Appellate Advocacy for the Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF, and which is, if our listeners and viewers don't know, it's the largest public interest law firm in the country, defending religious liberty, free speech, the rights of the family, the rights to life throughout the United States. And in some of the biggest cases that we've had in the Supreme Court, ADF and you have been a part of. I think you
Yes.
particularly have been involved in at least 12 cases at the Supreme Court, which is amazing stuff for someone at the stage of your career. That's amazing, amazing stuff. And you got a beautiful wife, 5 children, and this new book. And the book for our listeners and viewers to know is called Loving God's Children, The Church and Gender Ideology. And John, I just have to say, it's fantastic. I'm going to call it required reading for all the young people in my life. Well, Catholics of all ages, young and old, but certainly especially our young people, you really summarize the church's teaching so beautifully on the dignity of the person and how we can respond with charity and truth to some of the issues that we're facing here in our society. So, without further ado, welcome, John. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that.
Now, we want to talk first, kind of just background if we can. I'm really interested in how did a busy Catholic lawyer with all of the caseload that you have and all your full-time job, plus your family life, how did you find the time to have such a well-researched and very thoughtful book that you've come out with this year?
Well, I don't think anybody goes to law school intending to publish a book about gender ideology. I certainly did not when I went to law school all the way back in the mid 1990s. But it was my work that actually initially drove it because over the last 5 years or so, the religious liberty and free speech dockets that I litigate all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court has probably become about 95% based on gender ideology. It started with boys identifying as girls showing up in the girls' showers and locker rooms and domestic abuse shelters and prisons and things like that. Then they came after folks in the workplace and demanded that they use preferred pronouns in places of public and private employment. Then you saw it move into sports, and the boys started winning all the girls' track races and swimming races and things like that because they identified as women. And then it moved to more of the organizational area where businesses were being persecuted and prosecuted by local government authorities because they couldn't hire individuals who expressed these ideologies consistent with the faith of the organization. And now finally today we've kind of like gotten to the very bottom of the barrel, which is they're coming for the kids. Where in schools you have secret transition policies where teachers and counselors are encouraged to ask kids what their gender identity is and then help them transition to that identity and keep it a secret from the parents. You've got California. Governor Newsom just vetoed a law that would have made a parent's failure to affirm their child's transition a reason to say that they've engaged in abuse or neglect and remove that child from the home. And you might say, well, Newsom vetoed it. That's great. Well, that's because at the bottom he said they can already consider that now. We don't need to change the law in order for them to do that. And then assisting states with some of these laws that prohibit the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery for minors. So in the course of all that work, I was learning all the science. I was learning where all the cultural pressure points came from. And as a Catholic lawyer, it was important that I also understand what the church had to say about this issue. And so I really started digging in and trying to get a better understanding of the theology, how the church's position flows from the theology of the body, but how Pope Francis and U.S. bishops in particular have spoken very beautifully about the subject of gender ideology. And all of that turned into a series of talks at parishes and for the diocese and things like that. And those talks started to turn into a book. And kind of like the last piece of the puzzle to find the time to put all the thoughts that were in my head down on paper. Our youngest daughter was in the Grand Rapids Youth Symphony last year, and she plays the concert harp. And so I'm her roadie, and I help her get that harp to and from practice. And that meant 2.5 hours every Monday night sitting in a high school auditorium with nothing else that I was required to do. And so I used that time to start mapping out the book. And I'm glad that you find it clear and easy to understand. I found that a number of adults, after reading it, wanted to buy multiple copies for their kids or grandkids and things like that. And my hope is that all the knowledge that I collected through my work and study over the years can be put to use so that people can start to have conversations about what is really a difficult subject.
No, it's a great inspiration, and the one of the things that struck me first about the book was how you do such a great job of summarizing the church's teaching, and my first thought was, wow, here's a busy attorney, and who, if I recall correctly, Western Michigan for undergrad. University of Minnesota for law school, right?
That's
And
correct.
how did you go about not go, you didn't go to a Catholic undergrad, Catholic law school. How did you go about getting that foundation of knowledge and understanding of the church's teaching that you were able then to be in the position to say, well, I'll spend a couple 2 hours a night, at my daughter's concert, I can write this. You had to have a solid foundation that was built over many years. How did you develop yourself to get to that point?
Well, I'm a cradle Catholic, and so I've attended Mass and gone to confession and prayed regularly my entire life. But I wouldn't say that growing up I had a deep education or root in the church's theology. I knew all the teachings, I followed all the teachings, but I couldn't have explained to you why we believed some of the things that we did. So for example, when I got married, we understood the church's teaching against contraception and, wanted to follow that. But we did it just trusting the church and not understanding the deeper teachings about why the church believed that. I'd never read Humana Vitae, probably hadn't even heard of it. Starting with uh, probably like our third child, so we had a lot of little kids at home. At our parish, there was an article in the bulletin about an upcoming apologetics class. And I thought, as the kids get older, they're going to have questions about these things. And as a lawyer, I want to be able to answer those the same way I answer questions for my clients. But I'm not going to be able to do that unless I understand much, much more deeply why the church teaches what it does. Where do all these things come from? Where do we find them in the Bible? What's the logical reasoning behind it? And so it was that apologetics class that really kind of lit a fire under me and my wife. And so in the ensuing years, about 20 years now since I took that class, we both dived deeply into theology and Catholic spirituality, between the two of us reading hundreds of books. And for me, it was always more about the biblical analysis and the doctrine as a lawyer. That was a lot like analyzing the Constitution and statutes. And so I was naturally attracted to that. My wife had an interest in that, but also deep interest in the spiritual aspect of it and read some of the great spiritual masters. And, sometimes I was teaching her things, sometimes she was teaching me things, but we kind of put together our own 20-year course in Catholicism and understanding all the teachings of the church. And, we were successful then in being able to answer all of our kids' questions. They all went on to Catholic colleges. We've got one still at home, but there's a strong chance that she's going to be going to a Catholic college a year from now. And have very deep understanding of the faith, much more so than we did when they were their age. And as a result, really have the courage to go out into the public square and speak about the church's teachings in some of these really difficult areas, especially abortion and, gender ideology and the meaning of marriage, in ways that are just beautiful. So it was in that intentional going deeper, that was just a huge benefit to our family and ultimately put me in a position where I could even think about writing a book like this.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and it really tells a lot about what we all have to do, no matter what our profession is or our occupation, in the way of ongoing educational formation, where we can't expect someone else to give that to us or have it just implanted. But it took a lot of intentional, rigorous study over many years in your free time and with your wife, and a wonderful, inspiring way to do it. You touched on a few of the kind of the pressure points that sort of inspired you in what you were seeing in your course of your work that inspired you to start seeing how it was developing and it really became the meat or the central part of the book and the structure of the book. And one of the things that I think a lot of us who aren't involved in these areas on a regular basis, we certainly see the headlines probably in the sports area. And as a sports person, that's what had kind of struck me about this issue first. What's the kind of the current state of the law in the United States regarding transgender athletic participation?
Well, it's definitely in flux right now. We've got a case on behalf of the women athletes in Connecticut who lost 15 state track and field titles to two boys who identified as girls. And that's been boxed up in court for a long time. The trial court judge sat on it for years until all the participants had graduated and then claimed that the case was moot. And then the Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, basically said that even though the girls had a claim to have the records changed to reflect that they were the actual winners, based on who was allowed to participate in the race, they basically said, well, it doesn't matter if we change the records because everyone will still know who won. And so they don't have a remedy that we can give them. And so now we're in front of the Second Circuit en banc. It was 15 judges this summer, just trying to get the case reinstated. So that one's been a very slow starter. But there's a parallel set of cases. At Alliance Defending Freedom, we developed a model Save Women's Sports policy. And that's been adopted into law in 22 states, and it requires that sports be separated to or to boys and girls teams based on sex, not gender identity, the way that it's always been done. And those acts have been challenged in numerous jurisdictions, and so the litigation is ongoing right now. It's probably still about 2 years away from getting to the Supreme Court, but we have one terrific decision out of West Virginia that upholds their law. That's on appeal right now. We have a case out of Idaho where we lost in the district court and in the Ninth Circuit. And we're waiting to see if the court will hear that en banc, and if not, we'll ask the Supreme Court. But for all the non-lawyers who might be listening, it's difficult to get a case to the Supreme Court until the issue has percolated for a while, if you think about it that way, where numerous federal courts of appeals have weighed in. So it may not be time for that yet, although we'll certainly try. But similar challenges are out there involving several other laws like that. At the federal level, the Obama administration had issued regulations that reinterpreted Title IX to require public high schools to assign sports teams by gender identity and threatened them with loss of funding or lawsuits from the Department of Justice if they wouldn't comply. When the Trump administration came in, all of those regulations were repealed, and they made clear that they understood Title IX to require that boys and girls be given their own showers, locker rooms, and sports teams based on sex. And now the Biden administration has gone back on that, and they're about to come out with rules probably by December, maybe January at the latest, that will reinterpret Title IX all over again, and there'll surely be litigation over that. We're already talking to potential clients who will be affected by that. So with respect to the athletics, there's really a lot of uncertainty right now.
And it sounds like so many issues, it comes down to politics really mattering and votes really mattering. And it sounded interesting from the Catholic layperson's perspective that one practical thing they might be able to be involved in is what you described, the effort at the state legislative level for the model act that you've prepared, and those that are involved in the political process or grassroots movements in their own communities. Can you tell us the name of that act and the website for that so that folks that are interested can take a look at that?
It's the Save Women's Sports Act, and you can find more information about that at ADF's website, which is adflegal.org. And you can see where the states have passed it, and you can see what the language looks like. It's really fairly simple. It just makes clear that sports, as they have been since Title IX was enacted, are separated based on sex. And really, the scientific data that we have on this is compelling. The other side will say, well, if you suppress the hormones in a boy who identifies as a girl, that basically levels the playing field. And just at a conceptual level, that doesn't make any sense because we've never bent the rules of boys and girls sports based on someone's lack of athletic ability. If there's a boy who runs slower and isn't as strong as other boys, we don't say that he gets to compete against the girls. We just recognize that it's appropriate as a class to assign boys and girls teams. But even if you take that claim on its face and try to deal with it, numerous studies, including some extensive work done by the International Rugby Association, have determined that simply reducing hormone levels in a boy does not reduce the inherent advantages that they obtain from going through puberty, where their muscle mass is much bigger, their bones are much bigger, just all the body development that goes into creating an athlete has already happened. And so diminishing the testosterone actually has very little impact. Even after you do that, boys still have incredibly huge advantages, double-digit percentages in how fast they run, how high they jump, how much they can lift, all those things. And so then some on the other side will raise the issue of students who haven't gone through puberty yet. But even there, just the natural way their bodies have been put together as a result of the testosterone that they bathed in the womb make a difference. And so in the West Virginia case, the plaintiff is a middle school boy who identifies as a girl. And in his seventh grade year, he went from basically being at the bottom of the shot put and the discus and things like that to advancing to the conference championship, an advancement that no girl was able to achieve with the same kind of training and working diligently and things like that. There were natural physical advantages that were at work there. And when that happens, then girls are displaced from conference final meets, from state championship final meets, even from the podium and getting the gold medals. And so that's an important issue. People need to be aware of it. And it's one where the public opinion is still firmly on our side. And so if you don't have one of these acts in your states, then you should start talking to your state legislators about it because we need to act.
Yeah, and I think it was very interesting in the book, the discussion that you had of Billie Jean King and others who had worked so hard for so many years to courageously expand the opportunities for women in sports to the point where they would have equality, and a thing that's still ongoing as far as equal opportunity and equal opportunity for women in sports. And then, so it's an issue that really is obviously way more than a Catholic issue, and a lot of support with people from all across any sort of spectrum politically that maybe recognize the truth in this circumstance.
Well, yeah,
It,
there's some interesting political partners on these issues, and not just in sports, because even what some would call radical feminists who may not agree with us on our teachings on abortion and marriage and things like that. Are partnering on not only athletics, but on keeping men who identify as women out of the women's shelters, out of the women's prisons, and taking opportunities for women. As I note in the book, that the so-called women's greatest champion for Jeopardy right now is actually a man who identifies as a woman. And so every time that happens, it's erasing women's accomplishments, it's erasing women's ability to get equal opportunity. But even among those category of people who would join forces with us, the gender activists will just malign them. There's an acronym that they use, TERFs, TERFS, and that stands for Trans Eradicating Radical Feminists. They use it as a slur against women who want to preserve rights for women. And if you had proposed something like this, before 10 years ago, 99% of the country would have said, are you crazy? Of course we have to protect women. It's almost unbelievable that we have to have that conversation about it today. But many people, both across religious denominations, but outside of religion entirely, as you mentioned, can find agreement on this issue that biology matters when it comes to women opportunity.
yeah, and I think that the way you've presented the issues and the potential responses in the book have just been wonderful from the standpoint of, especially from, say, the Catholic parent perspective, and having that instinct of charity and love for your children being this driving instinct and combining that charity with the truth, that charity plus truth. And I think it's Pope Benedict you quote, right, that you can't have charity without the truth is no good, and neither is the truth without charity. And for a lot of parents, I think they can feel very overwhelmed by what you kind of described as the way that there can be a bit of vitriol, maybe is the best way to say it, or maybe irrational type arguments, and being able to step back. And in the school context, for instance, what are kind of the things that you see? I mean, maybe explain to Catholic parents out there what their rights are, and what are the kind of things they need to think about with regard to what their rights may be in the setting of their kids are in school and there's either the bathroom issue or a curriculum issue, or some of these privacy issues where they're not given the notice of what's maybe being told, or communications with their underage children. And maybe explain a little bit as well about, are there differences at public versus private versus Catholic schools?
Yeah, let's start with that. And what I'm going to say about public schools, hopefully will encourage many people to send their kids to Catholic schools or to homeschool them, because what's happening in public schools across the country is frightening. If you're at a Catholic school, that school should already be endorsing the church's teachings on gender ideology, that our bodies and our souls are not somehow separate things where whatever we feel is what we should act on, and our bodies are just shells that we can modify any way that we want to in order to make them align with our minds. That's the Gnostic heresy that the church stamped out in the 2nd century and many times since then. And in many dioceses now, you'll have gender ideology policies where they make clear that restrooms and sports teams and school uniforms and things like that must be assigned based on sex, not identity, and refusing to use preferred pronouns and other things like that, because that's what's best for kids. If your Catholic school is not doing that, then you need to talk to the principal. And if you don't get any redress there, you need to talk to the superintendent of Catholic schools for your diocese. And if that's not helpful, then you need to go to your bishop. Because it's important that we have Catholic schools that live by the truth. Now, switching to the public schools, obviously, unless we're out there active in politics and electing the right school boards, which I would encourage people to do, you're going to see where all this really hits the road. The schools, like I mentioned early on, have in many instances, secret transition plans where counselors and teachers and staff members are encouraged to help kids transition if they have a different gender identity than their sex, and to not tell their parents about it, even to the point of continuing to use sex-based pronouns when talking to the parents over the phone or at parent-teachers conferences. And some of our cases involve issues where the parents already knew that their child was suffering or experiencing gender dysphoria, which is a diagnosed mental health issue, and went to the school and said, I do not want them transition. We're going to counseling and addressing it these other ways. And the schools did it in secret anyway. So if you're worried about that and you think there might be such a policy, the U.S. Supreme Court has long recognized that parents have the right to direct the upbringing and especially the medical care of their children. And schools don't have the right to take that away from parents. And so that's one place where the law is very supportive. Another thing that you see is with the preferred pronouns. A lot of public schools are asking kids to identify their pronouns and then compelling everyone to use them. Well, there are free speech rights that apply for both students but also teachers if they're in the position of being forced to use compelled pronouns. And first a little bit about the law on that, and then second a little bit about why we would object. On the law, I personally argued and won a case in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's the only federal court of appeals to address the issue so far. And they said that for a professor at a public university, there was both a free speech right and a free exercise right not to be compelled to use those pronouns. And that's a precedent that I think we can use in K through 12 education too. And then, obviously when you're talking about your student, there are parental rights involved in that as well. And some, well-meaning Catholics might say, well, can't we at least use the preferred pronouns and the name changes and things like that when they happen? That's just basic human dignity. We're being asked to use the very words that this individual wants to identify themselves. It's not Catholic to reject who they are. Well, here's the problem with that. When kids are experiencing gender dysphoria, and we're talking adolescents and teenagers now, if they're left alone and not affirmed, 80 to 95% of them will naturally align their mind with their body, which is what's best for them. But if you start to affirm them with the pronouns and then you allow them to use the opposite sex bathroom and things like that, there's virtually a 100% guarantee that they will continue down the road of gender dysphoria. And the preferred pronouns and the name changes and the bathrooms and things like that are basically the gate or the entryway to the puberty blockers and the cross-sex hormones and the surgery. And what you'll hear the gender activists say is, well, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter or vice versa? And that's just a lie. We know that children who are experiencing gender dysphoria do have shockingly high suicide rates, 12 times higher than the general population, because they've got a serious mental health issue. That's why we need to accompany them, to love them, to help them get the healing and the help that they need. But what they don't tell you is that the best long-term study we have from Europe, this is over a 30-year period, adults who have fully transitioned using the surgery, their suicide rates went up to 19 times the general population, and they had higher incidence of other mental health problems, and they had infertility, and they had loss of sexual function, and loss of bone density, and brain development problems, and heart issues, and ultimately cut their life expectancies in half. So when you're doing the gateway or the entry point of preferred pronouns, it's the most unloving thing that you can do, because you're sending these kids down a path of lifelong misery, hardship, early death, and medical and mental health issues. And it's not just conservatives or Catholics who are saying this. These are medical professionals in Sweden, Finland, England, Denmark, the places that kind of pioneered this gender care medicine. And that point about the 19 times the population suicide rates for those who fully transition, that's one that the Obama administration's Health and Human Services Department put out in some of its guidance and warning to people about these transitions. So that's why it's important that we use the legal tools that we have available to us to stop from preventing those lies from having to be spoken against our rights. The last point I'll make about the schools has to do with the privacy spaces, and that's been harder. There have been a number of parents and kids over the years who have challenged the boys and the girls' showers and the locker rooms and the restrooms. And by and large, most of those have gone in favor of the schools, not in favor of the students. Now, there are some exceptions to that. There's a very high-profile case that came out of the 11th Circuit in the last year that went the right way. And we think that could be a turning point, or, in the future, the next time we lose one, a launching pad to the Supreme Court to get them to take a look at this issue. But we need to stand up there as well, to allow young girls, teenage girls, when they're going through puberty, the most vulnerable time for them, when they're most concerned about their bodies and privacy and things like that, to allow boys into their privacy spaces. As parents, we can't allow that. So again, there's many opportunities where we can push back politically, but we can also do so legally. And we have to do that if we want to protect our kids, but also if we're interested in the best interests of those who are experiencing dysphoria.
Yeah, and I think that's why your book, Loving God's Children, is such a tremendous resource as almost as a handbook to both cite the medical research and some of these facts and figures that support, but as well as the how to say things in the charitable way, and also from the standpoint of a little bit like we talked about with respect to the state legislation in the sports area, a great resource for Catholic faithful to take a look at some of the dioceses that have that you cite in the book and the back of the book that have the policies already in place, that they might have something practical to provide to their Catholic school if they're in the Catholic school, or to their superintendent, or to their bishop if they have a after they've gone to the appropriate levels, or if they have a relationship with their bishop, as some of the Catholic faithful do, to be able to point to some of the good things that are being done in other dioceses as something that can be adopted, and explaining how it's fully in line with the church teaching, and how Pope Francis himself has spoken on multiple occasions about some of these issues that are, I think, going to be helpful for maybe the the teachers on the ground and the those running the Catholic schools on the ground who would themselves feel a little bit, feeling it from all directions. So,
Yeah.
so I think
And one note of caution too, if you're in a diocese that doesn't have one of those policies, but you've got a bishop who's amenable to promulgating one, is that you need to make sure that there's adequate diocesan education before that policy issues. We've probably all seen what's happened in the Diocese of Cleveland, where the bishop has been maligned as a hater and a bigot, and even had terrible things said about him by Catholic parents of Catholic school children in the Catholic schools. Likewise, in Portland, a few months ago, they had a very good policy they issued, and it resulted in a mass revolt where they had to end up removing the head of Catholic schools and several principals. And so, if you're going to be in a diocese where you're moving forward with something like this, it's important that you educate everybody before the policy is implemented. What a difference it would have made in Cleveland if the parishioners at every parish had read the book first so that
right.
they knew how to respond. They understood why the bishop's policy was one of love and not one of hate and discrimination. I mean, not that any bishop would act with hate and discrimination. Or even the head of the schools in Portland or the principals. Maybe if they had understood that their own perceptions about the gender identity movement and their acceptance of them were harmful to the very kids that they're trying to protect, that they would have had a very different reaction when that policy was rolled out. And so it's important that we get our ducks in a row first and not precipitously push out the policy and then start the education process. Because as a diocese, it's our responsibility to make sure people understand church teaching. And once you understand the church teaching and the science, it would be difficult for anyone to object to one of these policies because they clearly are the way to best show the church's love for her children.
Very true, very true. And I think the other area that is of interest to Catholic faithful that you identified was those that are Catholics, and it applies to anyone that has a strong religious faith that happen to be in the position of being a small business owner, and those small business owners sometimes it's awfully complex to know what the right thing to do is. What are you seeing as far as potential challenges that Catholic small business owners might be facing regarding all this new government regulations that seem to be changing? The case law that you're talking about seems to be changing all the time, and it seems like there's an expansion of various discrimination categories that are hard to keep up with. What do you see from the Catholic small business owner perspective?
Well, both at the national and the state level, there's been a massive shift in the last 10 years of laws involving hiring and public accommodations to expand them to sexual orientation and gender identity. And if you think about the purpose of those, sometimes they can be done in a spirit of goodwill, that we want to protect discrimination against anybody because of, who they are is the way these bills are sold. But the problem is then it puts Catholic business owners in particular in a very rough spot. So say that you have a Catholic healthcare agency, or you're running a Catholic school, or you've even got a Catholic bookstore, and you need to hire a new employee. Well, you want to be able to hire someone who shares the Catholic Church's faith when it comes to these issues. And if a man who presents as a woman would come apply for a position to sell books at the bookstore, or to be at the front desk of the healthcare agency, or to serve as a playground monitor at the Catholic school, those are all unacceptable positions for someone who can't reconcile their body with their sex. It sets a bad example for all of the kids and creates confusion in ways that are going to be harmful to kids and to customers and things like that. Or even the customers themselves. If you're a creative professional, say you're a Catholic artist, and someone comes in and they ask you to paint their same-sex wedding, or to paint the man who has transitioned as a woman to celebrate his femininity, those are projects that they can't take. And so the law is slowly starting to catch up to these changes in the statutes to provide the necessary religious and free speech protections. So starting with the creative professionals, we had a case in the U.S. Supreme Court just this past year called 303 Creative. And Lori Smith was a graphic design and website designer. She was an artist who did those things. And she wanted to expand her website design business into doing weddings to celebrate God's plan for marriage between one man and one woman. But she lived in the same state, Colorado, as Jack Phillips, the baker who was prosecuted by the Colorado Civil Rights Commission for respectfully declining to create a cake to celebrate a so-called same-sex marriage. And so she brought a pre-enforcement lawsuit, and we were successful at the Supreme Court, a 6-3 decision that says because of the free speech clause, you can't force a religiously minded business to speak against its beliefs. And that included not only website design, but that would include art projects, photography, videography, the whole panoply of things that you can think of. On the employment side, we already have a good precedent, but it's a limited one that says if you're a church, there's a ministerial exception. And so, we think of ministers as priests, but it's broader than that. Anyone who is inculcating the faith in someone else can be considered a minister. And so in our Catholic schools, that would protect our ability to hire the teachers. But how about the playground monitor or the cafeteria worker, or the classroom aide that may not be inculcating faith in anyone. They simply have a job there, but they're supposed to live a good example of a Catholic life. Well, we're advancing several cases in that space right now to create what's called the co-religionist doctrine, which says that a religiously minded business or a religious organization, they have the ability to only hire employees who share the organization's faith. And from a secular perspective, this is an easy concept to understand. We've all in the business world attended management and training sessions where they talk about everybody being on the same page and having to row in the same direction. And no one can be dissenting from the company mission statement, because if you have one dissenting person, then the entire organization will falter. Well, that's just as true for religiously minded organizations. They too have to be able to have employees who share the same faith, share the same principles, and will act upon those principles. And that gives us justification for that. But those cases are kind of in an early stage, and it's truly too early to tell how the courts will treat those. We also have some protection possibly in Title VII, which refers to religious organizations. And it's unclear whether that includes all of the employees in a religious organization or just some of them. But if you're a Catholic lawyer and you have a small law firm, or you're a Catholic business person and you're listening to this, the important thing is that you get your corporate documents set up in such a way so that if this crisis ever comes to pass, you'll be able to assert your religious rights. Large publicly traded corporations can't claim religious protection. The reason why Hobby Lobby was able to do that was because they had a closely held business and they had documents which made it very clear that they were going to live out their faith principles in their business. So if you don't have that in your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, your employee handbook, all those sorts of things, it'll make it impossible for you to assert a religious liberty defense when someone who wants to reject and overturn your beliefs comes and applies for a job, or comes to make a request of you at your shop and it's something that you can't fulfill. So we need to be intentional. Go find your local Catholic corporate lawyer who will be able to help you get those documents in order so that it's clear that your business is not just a profit-making machine, but it's one that's driven by your faith principles. That will give you the utmost protection when the lawsuit has to happen.
That's very good and very sound. And I one of the things you mentioned in there reminded me that one of the few cases that I can easily remember the name of is one of the leading cases in that area, and that's the Hosanna Tabor case. And the reason I can easily remember that, for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, is I think I may be the only Catholic lawyer who's a graduate of Hosanna Tabor Lutheran School in Redford, Michigan. That's the originator of that case. So we
That's
grew up,
incredible.
we grew up in Detroit, right on the Redford border. Grew up good Lutherans, and it wasn't very far eventually for me to cross the Tiber and become a Catholic, because I had a great foundation of the faith from my parents, and frankly from Hosanna Tabor Lutheran. They good people there, really had a good understanding of the Bible and the faith, and then it made converting later after I met my wife, who was a great example of, and it's a long story, another show to talk about my conversion, but
I'll come back and
I'm
interview
going
you
to
about all
argue
that.
I'm probably the only Catholic lawyer that graduated from Hosanna Tabor.
No, that could be. And what you might remember from that case is that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Lutheran school 9-0. And people sometimes don't realize how protective the U.S. Supreme Court has been about religious liberty over the last 10 to 15 years. And that case is a great example. And I'm glad to hear that story of yours. Maybe someday I'll come back and interview you so everybody can hear your story.
Now, what about one of the things this year? Well, one of the things that the Catholic faithful are sometimes get interested in is what are the cases that they should maybe keep an eye on at the Supreme Court. So, what you're there, you're studying this and you're following this. What are some of the interesting cases that the Catholic faithful might want to keep their eye out for this October term of the Supreme Court?
Yeah, well, I'll start with two that we're working on right now and another one that's in the pipeline. The first is in the pro-life space. The second is in this gender identity space. In the pro-life context, you and your listeners may have heard about our litigation challenging the federal government's approval of the abortion pill and then their subsequent removal of all the safety restrictions. And the argument is the pill should not have been endorsed in the first place because of the safety problems and because the FDA used the wrong mechanism to try to push it through on an emergency basis. But even more relevantly, in recent years, that the administrations have peeled back all the safety requirements. It used to be you'd have to have 3 doctor visits. Now there's none. It used to be that only a doctor could prescribe an abortion pill. Now it doesn't have to be a doctor. It used to be that there had to be an in-person dispensing requirement. Now you can get it through the mail or you can pick it up at the Walgreens or the CVS. It used to be that you could only use an abortion pill very early in the pregnancy. Now the number of weeks that you can take one has been expanded by the FDA. So in the Fifth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals, we were successful in getting all of those safety measures reinstated. And they rejected at least on a preliminary basis, rejected our request that they take the pill off the market. But now all these problems of the CVSs and the Walgreens and the mail order abortion pills, if the Supreme Court were to uphold that, all those go away. And these women have to go back to doctors and make sure that they have a primary care physician who will take care of them if they have intense bleeding or other problems as a result of taking the abortion pill. So the FDA and Danco, the maker of the abortion pill, are asking the Supreme Court right now to take that case. And we're opposing that, but there's a pretty strong likelihood that that will happen. And if they do, then we're asking the court to take the question of whether the pill should be taken off the market entirely because of its dangers. So we'd appreciate your prayers on that. That's a really big one. In the gender identity space, we have a cert petition that the justices are considering at their conference tomorrow. And so we would ask for prayers on that too. The counselor's name is Brian Tingley. He's in Washington State, and he's challenging one of these so-called counseling censorship laws. They exist in 20 states and more than 100 jurisdictions in all. And what they say is that if a counselor wants to counsel someone to engage in same-sex activity or to identify as trans, you're free to do that, maybe even encouraged to do that. But if you wanted to encourage a client through therapy, a minor client, to live according to the teachings of the Catholic Church, when it comes to marriage and sexual identity, then you can have your license taken away. And this is a huge problem, especially for those group of young people called detransitioners. And these are young men and women who had gender dysphoria. They decided to transition to a different sex, then realized that that was a mistake and it was harmful and didn't solve their problems. And so they detransitioned back to where they began as their natal sex. And so for them, they're in desperate need of counseling in places like Washington State and the other states that have these laws. And yet, if they would go ask a counselor for that counseling help, the counselor could lose their license if they participated in it. And so we've got that case on the court's doorstep, and we should know within a week or two whether they're willing to take it. So pray for us and keep an eye on that. The other one, which is not quite there, but could be there very soon, a double-digit number of states, I can't remember now if it's about maybe 16, have passed these laws that prohibit the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery on minors. That was something I mentioned earlier on in the show. And so, of course, there were immediate challenges to those. And in all the federal trial courts where those challenges were brought, they issued injunctions stopping the enforcement of the law. But now those injunctions are getting to the courts of appeal, and we've been very successful in having them reversed and having the laws go into effect. So the Sixth Circuit in cases involving Kentucky and Tennessee, 2 separate matters, but also the 11th Circuit in a case, I think involving Georgia, but I might be wrong about that, have reversed the injunctions and said that the state's laws were based on sound science and there was no reason to enjoin them. I have no doubt that more of those cases are going to quickly get to the circuit court level, and will rise to the Supreme Court just as fast. And so I'd be keeping an eye on that as well.
Well, this has just been fascinating, John. One of the things that I want to say is that what a wonderful example you are to all of us, the Catholic faithful, young and old, on living out your faith and combining. A lot of times we have this dichotomy between the faith and our work. And just from everything that you've talked about today, what shines through is the way that you've been able to live out your faith in your work. So one last question for you that would really benefit our younger listeners would be, for those that are maybe thinking about law school, or they're in law school, or they're in a young stage of their career as lawyers, what advice for you do you have for those that maybe have this, maybe they're drawn to the type of work you do, the religious liberty and the other work that you do in the public interest arena? What advice do you have for those young lawyers or young lawyers to be?
Well, first, you need to be well grounded in your faith. Even if you end up not going to law school or not pursuing a legal career in religious liberty and pro-life issues and things like that, whatever you're doing, you can take your Catholic faith into the workplace. I look at our kids and they're doing that in medicine and physics and music therapy and teaching and sacred architecture. Each one of them has found a way to live their faith in the work that they do. And so everyone needs to do that. And to that end, there's a book that I recommend by Father Scanlon. He was the president at Steubenville Franciscan University, and kind of made that university the great Catholic beacon of light that it is. And it's called What Does God Want? And it's all about discernment, and it applies particularly to vocational and employment discernment, but really to any decisions you make in your life. And it helps make sure that you're not doing things out of your own desires or self-interest, but that you're always looking for God's will in every one of those decisions. And that was a huge help to me. If you're in law school, we have a program at Alliance Defending Freedom. It's called the Blackstone Program, where more than 100 law school students each summer come and they spend 3 weeks with us, and they're trained in some legal principles, some ways to think that they may not be getting at their liberal law schools, but also training about how to think about and speak about all these difficult issues, whether it's the pro-life issues, or it's gender identity, or it's same-sex marriage, or it's parental rights, all these things. They're getting training from some of the best experts in the country on those things. Then they have a summer internship where they're mentored by someone who has Christian faith and is already living their faith in the workplace, who can then be a mentor to that young person. And then there's a week at the end where they all come back together for some final training and ascending forth. And again, whether you end up going into religious liberty and pro-life work or not, it's just a great way to get yourself centered on keeping your faith front and center in your workplace. The last thing that I would encourage people to do is just keep praying. For me, there's no reason why I should be doing what I'm doing if you look at my resume. As you mentioned, I went to Western Michigan University, which is not, as you know, a satellite of the University of Michigan. It's just a regional public college in Michigan. They don't have any strong religious bent to them like Hosanna Tabor. And then I went to the University of Minnesota Law School, same thing. In fact, today they proudly boast that 25% of their incoming class is LGBT identified. And then I went into corporate law practice after that. But along the way, God kept putting, people and moments in my life that were opening doors to a deeper faith and to hearing his call. Finding my wife was absolutely indispensable. She is a very holy woman and has done such a wonderful job helping me grow in my faith and raising our kids in faith. But professional opportunities too. And every time one of those came up, we would sit down with the kids and we would pray and discern and try to ask what God wanted us to do in that situation. And the doors kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the next thing you know, I'm arguing cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, including Obergefell, which was the same-sex marriage case. And I had the honor of defending the Catholic Church's teachings on marriage, even though we ultimately lost that one. And so I won't take credit for any of that. The entire time, God was my career planner, and the Holy Spirit was my constant guide, both of my professional life, my personal family life, and my spiritual life. And so that's the best advice that I have to all the young people who are thinking about this kind of a career, or any career where they want their faith to matter, is that they just give their lives up to Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, and allow themselves to be led where God wants to take you, because extraordinary things happen when you do that.
Wow, thank you, John. That is so beautiful, so wise, so much there that I'm glad we had that recording because that's brilliant stuff that I'm going to want to listen to over and over, and I'm going to share with as many people as possible. It's just been such a privilege, such an honor to get to know you, John, to have you come on the show here, and there was so much here that we could probably talk for a long, long time. But you've got important things to do today. I'm going to thank you for being with us today. And where can those that are listening learn more about you, more about your work, the work of ADF, and more about the book?
adflegal.org is our website. They can learn more about me, but especially about our cases. There's lots of ways to support what we do at ADF. We don't charge any of our clients a dime for any of the work that we do. We do it entirely from donations from generous ministry friends who are willing to support the effort. But we're looking for people just to support us in prayer as well. We're trying to build a 1 million-person army to pray for our clients and the cases and the judges and justices and things like that. As for the book, Loving God's Children, The Church and Gender Ideology, it's published by Sophia Institute Press. It's available through all the major booksellers, but if you're willing to do it, I prefer you to do it through the Sophia Institute website. The reason for that is Amazon will scrape 55% of the proceeds off the top. And I would much rather have those dollars go to Sophia Institute, which is a longtime faithful Catholic publisher, which is putting out absolutely tremendous Catholic books right now, rather than to a company which, for every one book like mine, there are 100 that are on the other side trying to encourage people on this insane trans ideology. And then, once you've read the book, if you like it as much as Bill did, and as others have, then spread the word, pay it forward by buying copies for other people, but especially start having these conversations with your kids about it, because I can guarantee you that if you're not talking to your kids about it, they're hearing it from their friends at school, they're seeing it on social media, which I hope you're banning until they're at least 18 years old, but if not, it's everywhere, and it's certainly going to be in the culture when they go to college. And so they need to learn it from us first, and they need to understand why ours is the message of truth and love. And if we do that, we're going to save a lot of people. And so I hope people can get excited and spread the good word.
Thank you, John. And again, the book is Loving God's Children from Sophia Institute Press. And I can say we'll be purchasing several copies. Keep them on the shelves for the other apostolate that we're involved in is the Our Lady of Martyrs Shrine in Auriesville, New York. Our bookstore, Sophia's been very good relationship with our little Catholic bookstore in the shrine over the years, and so we'll gladly have your book on the shelves there and support and ask our listeners to do the same. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the Ask a Catholic Lawyer podcast. It's a blessing to be with you. Remember to send your questions for future episodes or suggestions or recommendations of Catholic lawyers to have on the show to askacatholiclawyer@gmail.com, askacatholiclawyer@gmail.com. And until the next time, may our Lord watch over us, provide us all the grace and blessings we need to do his work, and may Our Lady and all the angels and saints pray for us and protect us. Thank you very much.